The room in a hurry. So, welcome to the Cathedral of St. John the Divine, a house of prayer for all people, though we interpret prayer in 100 different ways. What we're doing tonight is a form of prayer. It's praying on some of the realities in our world that need changing and reflecting on how we might be called to change them ourselves. This is an evening of reflection on James Baldwin, who the quote on the front page says, "Artists," Mr. Baldwin said, "artists are here to disturb the peace." And I told a couple of folk that when I was in the 7th grade, way in North Carolina, deep in North Carolina, shall we say, I found a copy, and I don't know how it came to me, or why I picked it up, but I found a copy of James Baldwin, The Fire Next Time. And I thought, well, I didn't know there was a fire the first time. And so I read the book, and I did not understand a word of it. It was too far beyond me. I couldn't grasp it, partly because racism is such an anesthetic. In the Christian vocabulary, you would say sin is an anesthetic, but for this evening's purposes, we're going to say racism is an anesthetic because it puts you to sleep to the realities around you. And that's the power of sin in the Christian vocabulary. It's the power of racism in this nation. And it is the besetting sin of the United States, make no mistake about it. But when I finished the book, I knew, enough of it penetrated that I said to myself, there is something big going on here. And I don't know what it is, but it's disturbing, and I need to find out. It took me a few more years to find out, but I did. And here we are tonight in this great cathedral where James Baldwin spoke and from which he was buried. And we're here tonight. I want to thank the Layman's Club of the cathedral who are underwriting this event and helping. Those of you out here who are members of the Layman's Club, thank you for your generosity and support of this event. And to say to Elizabeth Howard, our Madeline Lingle artist in residence, thank you for organizing this and putting it together. We have a whole string of artists in residence, ranging from brilliant scholars to high wire artists, Philippe Petit, who walks the length of the cathedral on a tightrope. Anyway, it's a diverse group and a great many skills. We welcome Gabrielle Belote. Welcome. And she got safely off the subway. We're glad. She is a staff writer for Literary Hub, and you can read in the introduction the places where her work has appeared. I mean, from the Times to the New Yorker, the Cut, the Atlantic, and so on and so on. The only thing missing that I could see was the New York Post, but I guess you'll get around to that sooner or later, won't you? And then Nicholas Boggs, professor at New York University, and he teaches in the Department of English. And I noticed, being from North Carolina, that there was a reference to Duke University in his brief resume, so I checked it out, and he said it was a literary connection only. He didn't actually go there and has no connection. I went to Chapel Hill next door anyway. He is working he's currently working on a literary biography of Baldwin, forthcoming. When is it forthcoming?
long ways away.
A long ways away, but we'll look for it. But welcome to all of you, and welcome to all of you for this great evening. And I welcome your participation and hope for your enjoyment.
Thank
Matt?
you. Thank you, Dean Daniel. And welcome to our first close conversation in 2019. We hope to have a few others, and I'll mention that after our program. We had hoped to have this evening's program in the Poets' Corner, which is on the other side of the cathedral when you come in. Although with a group this size, we have a difficulty with sound, but James Baldwin's stone is there. And as the dean mentioned, on its stone, it said, "Artists are here to disturb the peace." So I hope when you're going out, you'll walk down the nave on the other side and take a look at the James Baldwin stone in the Poets' Corner. James Baldwin had a connection with the cathedral. A few months before If Beale Street Could Talk was published in 1974, he received the Centennial Medal for Artist as Prophet. He was the third recipient. The first was Tennessee Williams. The second was Martha Graham. And there's a wonderful photograph of James Baldwin here in the archives of the cathedral. His funeral was held here on December 9th, 1987. It began at noon, and people started lining up and sitting on the steps of the cathedral at 9:30 in the morning. The cathedral was filled. Leroy Jones, Toni Morrison spoke. Odetta sang Motherless Child, Battle Hymn of the Republic. The cathedral choir sang the 23rd Psalm and the 121st song. Hugh Masekela was here playing the trumpet with his trio, and Dean Morton led the procession. And then it was in 2011 that James Baldwin was inducted into the Poets' Corner. You have to have been dead for 20 years before you're considered for the Poets' Corner, so it was a while. But again, I hope you stop by the Poets' Corner on your way out. It's very difficult, if not impossible, because James Baldwin's work is so complex and there's so much depth, to do anything in an hour, let alone 2 novels or 2 books. So we're gonna try. I thought, Nicholas, that kind of a point of entry here was for you to just review for us a little bit of the chronology of his life, and to look at the fact that at 14 years old, he was a pastor. And although he denounced his faith later on, he did write in The Fire Next Time, "It took a long time for me to disengage from this excitement. And on the blindest, most visceral level, I never really have and never will. There was no music like the music, no drama like the drama of the saints rejoicing, the sinners mourning, the tambourines racing, and all those voices coming together and crying holy unto the Lord."
Thank you so much, Elizabeth. That's a wonderful quote, and of course it's reminiscent of Go Tell It in the Mountain and all sorts of different works. I want to thank Dean Daniel, Elizabeth, Gabrielle, and everybody for coming tonight. And also a special thank you to my students. I'm teaching in this frigid cold a 3-week intensive James Baldwin class with NYU Abu Dhabi students from across the globe, Palestine, Nepal, Michigan. So thank you guys for coming. We've spent the last 3 weeks deeply ensconced in his work. In Greenwich Village, they checked out where he lived on Horatio Street. They went to his mentor, Buford Delaney's home, or where it used to be. But we spent a lot of time in the Schomburg archives, which was just an incredible experience, thanks to Stephen Fullwood, the archivist up there, who put those papers together. And how appropriate and special on this final week for them to come here, which was such a historic place for Baldwin.
They had a tour.
And they had a tour. So thank you so much. As Elizabeth said, and as you all know, encapsulating Baldwin's life in a biography, much less in an introduction, is almost impossible. So I'm sure most of you have seen the film, the documentary, The Price of the Ticket, but if you haven't, check it out. It came out in 1987. PBS, and it has footage from the funeral, exquisite footage here at this cathedral. So I recommend that very highly. Okay, so Baldwin, of course, was the most important writer who ever lived, in my opinion. And he wrote across so many genres, of course, the essay, the novel, poetry, plays, screenplays, even, as we'll talk about tonight, children's literature. He was born in 1924, the first of 9 children. He was here in Harlem, and as we'll talk about more, yes, he was a child preacher, following the footsteps of his father, and we can see the influence, the sermonic influence throughout all of his writing. He was a voracious reader. At what now became the Schomburg, he would go there and read every book he could get his hands on. The early favorites were Uncle Tom's Cabin, A Tale of Two Cities, and the Bible as well. And he was also a lover of cinema and film, and he would go to Lafayette Theater and see cinema there. So one thing that I talked about with my students was the impact of two mentors on him in his early years. One was, of course, Richard Wright, who had just published Native Son to great acclaim, and took an interest in Baldwin and really supported him in his early career. The second was the magnificent black painter Buford Delaney, who lived in Greenwich Village, and Baldwin sort of taken under his wing, and as we talked about a lot, taught him how to kind of see the world as an artist, and also let him know that it was possible, along with Wright, to be a black man and to be an artist. As many of you know, in 1948, he got a fellowship and he left for Paris following his dream of discovering himself as a writer. He had published already a few reviews at that point, but he felt, as he said, as he wrote, that if he stayed in the States, he would only be allowed to be only a Negro writer. He'd only be allowed to write about other black writers, and he felt that his birthright was the world. It was in Paris that he began to write some of his incredibly important essays that were collected in the Native Son, also Stranger in the Village. He also finally, after many, many years, that novel that he'd been working on and Richard Wright had liked but had been rejected by publishers, was published as Go Tell It on the Mountain. It was very well received, of course, then the historic Giovanni's Room. And then in the 60s, he was pulled inexorably back to the United States and the civil rights movement, which we can talk about. And it was then that he wrote The Fire Next Time, first in the New Yorker, and that landed him on the cover of Time magazine in 1963. He also wrote Another Country during this period, the 60s. But this evening, and we'll talk about all of this, but this evening I think we're going to focus a little bit on what came after that, his sort of, until recently, less celebrated period in his career, which is the 1970s. That's when he bought a home in the south of France. He was still coming back to the States quite a bit, and he started to write what Gabrielle has called his masterpiece, If Beale Street Could Talk, and also Little Man, Little Man. And in these works, he was stretching himself as an artist. He was stretching himself in terms of the genres that he was experimenting in. And the establishment, the literary establishment at the time, the white literary establishment in particular, thought that he had fallen out of his artistic powers, had been in decline. But what we've really seen in the last few years, which has been wonderful, is a reassessment of this period in his life, but also his output during that period. So If Beale Street Could Talk, as everyone knows, it just became a movie that was nominated for a bunch of Oscars. Little Man, Little Man, it has been the honor of my life, and I can talk more about it, to play a role in republishing it from Duke University Press. It came out in 2018, and I have a couple copies here, but Aisha and Tijan Carreth the Smart, Baldwin's niece and nephew, who the book was based on, contributed the afterword and the foreword, which was just a beautiful experience. So we want to sort of reassess, I think, these later works. And Gabrielle, I came to know Gabrielle because I read just a beautiful piece she wrote for the Paris Review Online about If Beale Street Could Talk. And then she also wrote a wonderful piece for the New York Review of Books about Little Man, Little Man. So we are just excited to speak with each other, but also with all of you. It's Baldwin fans are always a warm and wonderful group of people in the world. So thank you all again for coming.
Gabby, as Nicholas has said in your recent essay in the Paris Review, you write that you believe If Beale Street Could Talk is Baldwin's masterpiece. And you write, a Black body forcibly incarcerated, that is put in chains. It is also a profound depiction of two Black people in love, both before and after one is wrongly imprisoned. Police brutality and injustice are something that we live with every day. Perhaps you can talk about why you believe this is his masterpiece, a little bit about what he was saying, but also how the arrest of Angela Davis and the case against Tony Maynard influenced him in the writing of this book.
Sure. Well, firstly, thank you for coming on such a cold night. The warmth of Baldwin fans is much warmer than the temperatures outside. I do believe that If Beale Street Could Talk is Baldwin's masterpiece. There's something about this book, for those of you, and incidentally, how many of you have read If Beale Street Could Talk? Okay, mainly on this side. Congratulations, left side of the chapel. There's something very tender to me about this book. We often think of James Baldwin, quite rightly, as someone who spoke truth to power, somebody who attacked injustice, somebody who, in a very sermonic, very pulpit-like manner, interrogated the racism, the white supremacist ideologies, and structural racism that he lived through. Most of his essays, you read them and you can feel a kind of brimming but justified anger. In Beale Street Could Talk, there is anger, but there is also love. There is something a lot softer in this book. It's not a soft book, but it's a tender depiction of Black people in love. And you don't see that as often as you might think, which is partly why the movie, which differs a little bit from the book, as we might talk about later, that's why it's so important to see these things on the screen and also on the page. You just don't often hear about Baldwin as a prophet of love, but in some ways he is. Not in the hippie sense that that term might suggest, but in a deeper, more philosophical sense. What does it mean for two Black bodies to be in love? It's not as simple as it sounds. There's a kind of danger in this. In the book, Fonny and Tish, the two protagonists, try to find an apartment in New York City. For a long time, they can't because, well, it's quite simple. People don't want African Americans to own apartments. They don't want them in their buildings. They don't want people who look like me in their buildings, people who are light brown or darker. And Baldwin interrogates not just this, but also an issue that's still very much with us, police brutality. Because this is also a book about a Black man who has been falsely accused of rape, which means that it's also a book that intersects with the Me Too movement as well. In other words, what does it mean when somebody is not just accused, but possibly incorrectly accused? And what does it mean when a Black man is presented as the only Black person in a lineup when the victim simply says, "It was a Black person who raped me"? That's why Fonny goes to prison. This isn't in the movie, but it's in the book. He's literally the only Black man in the lineup. Who else could you choose? Fonny wasn't even near the scene of the crime, but the policeman wanted him. He lusted after him in this very primal, dangerous way that many police officers still do, particularly when your body is like mine or darker. And you begin to fear what it means when a police officer looks at you a little too closely. In the case of this book, Fonny begins it in prison, and when the book ends, he's still incarcerated. There is a sense that he might get out, but we don't actually see him leave. And his wife, Tish, is pregnant. So there is another person who has to deal with the weight, the deep oceanic weight of racism as well, somebody who's not even been born as yet. Baldwin draws all of this together, and to me, this is his masterpiece easily, because it hits every single thing that was important then and still is important now. What does it mean to exist as a Black body in America? What does it mean to be pursued by the police? What does it mean to be accused of a crime? And in particular, accused of a crime with the misfortune of looking like Fonny. When a white police officer decides that you must be the perpetrator, even though you were on the other side of Manhattan when the crime happened. So there are many reasons why I think those of you on the right side of the pew should definitely read this book if you haven't already. The movie is a very moving depiction in some ways of what the book gives us. But the sharper edges of the book are not always represented in the movie. There are some things that the movie excised for various reasons. So I think the book is slightly better, controversial opinion, than the movie. But they're still very important because we get to see Black bodies beautifully on screen. But also we get to see the pain as well. That was Baldwin's project, to depict people not just as angels or demons, but with nuance, as flawed, but also beautiful human beings. So for all of those reasons, If Beale Street Could Talk is just a tremendous book, and I cannot be happier to talk about it. I could talk your ears off easily, and I'll try not to.
I think, Gabby, when you talk about love, I heard a lecture on Sunday on Martin Luther King. And it seems appropriate that this is the day after the day we remembered King, on an essay that he published in Christian Century. And he talks about the three kinds of love: eros, philia, and agape. And it occurred to me that in the book, not particularly as much in the movie, but in the book, that this love that Tish and Fonny have fulfills the three. And even though at the end, and the book is very sad at the end, and yet they have within them this love of goodness. It is and in some ways forgiveness. That even though we know that Baldwin was angry, often angry and spoke about the injustice, but there is a lot of love in that novel.
There certainly is, and it is important to position this talk, right after Martin Luther King's day. There are many reasons why it's particularly apt to start talking about If Beale Street Could Talk today. King famously said in his letter, which I have sometimes successfully and sometimes unsuccessfully tried to teach my students, his letter from a Birmingham jail, he famously said, of course, that injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. And this is kind of Baldwin's project. When it comes to love, you definitely feel that there is this sort of abiding, very vast sort of affection, and also just, love that Tish and Fonny have for each other, even when one of them is behind bars and you can't touch them. That, of course, is a particularly deep kind of love, when you can't even touch the person that you love the most. You can put your hand to the glass, but you can't touch them. But there is condemnation as well. Baldwin very clearly condemns America. He goes as far at one point as to say that if God made America, God should be beaten up, which is kind of also intersecting with his critique of the church. But Baldwin never fully left the church, even though he did leave the church. And you see that in that description as well. So there are many types of love, but there is definitely a fiery condemnation as well. And those two have to exist together. You can't have an imbalance of one or the other, or it's not going to be a Baldwin book.
So this was published by Dow Press at Beale Street in 1974, excuse me. And then the children's book, Little Man, was published in 1976, also by Dow Press. It was actually written at the request of James Baldwin's nephew. Uncle Jimmy would come to New York, and one day Tejan said to him, well, won't you write something for us? And so when the book was published, it wasn't particularly well received. So, Nick, perhaps you can take us through, they said that it didn't necessarily have an arc, but now that you've worked with Jennifer DeVere Brody to have it republished and with the Baldwin estate, perhaps you can tell us a little bit about the story and about what it meant to James Baldwin and why he called this a child's book for adults.
Sure, absolutely. And I think love actually is a good segue for discussing this. I mean, many people know this, of course, but one of the major shifts in Baldwin's writing from the 60s to the 70s was from a focus on interracial love as a form of redemption, as a form of healing the racial divide, to, in fact, in the 70s, a return to what, in a recent article in The Atlantic by my friend Dagmali Wuchet, into intraracial love. So we see that in If Beale Street Could Talk, and its focus on a young Black love story. But we also see it in Little Man, which was inspired by his niece and nephew, and other nephews, including Daniel, whose mother is here tonight. But it was born out of love. It was also dedicated to Buford Delaney, who was ailing at that time with the early stages of schizophrenia. And of course, Baldwin learned about love from Delaney. So, but its focus was on Black childhood in Harlem. As Baldwin put it, it was a celebration of the self-esteem of Black childhood. So it was a turn, I think, somewhat out of frustration with sort of the failure of more gains in the civil rights movement. It was a turn away from a focus on interracial reconciliation, and a turn, I think, at the tail end of the Black arts movement as well, to a focus on complex human representations of Black life. So the novel, so Dean Daniels talked about when he saw, when he read The Fire Next Time for the first time and how he didn't understand it. And I confess that when I first picked it up and I brought an original copy, I was in college taking the first class ever at Yale devoted entirely to Baldwin's work, and the professor mentioned that the Beinecke Rare Book and Manuscript Library had a copy of this children's book. And I thought, Baldwin wrote a children's book? Never heard of it. So I went there, and I, as he did with The Fire Next Time, I couldn't understand it. It looked like a children's book. It felt like a children's book, but it was described, and I'll just read the description. It had this image of the artist drawing Baldwin, and it says, a children's story for adults, an adult story for children, and for children and adults, a story of poignancy and character and charm. It's about coming of age in Harlem of boys named WT and TJ, the surface incidents of daily life that mask a menace in the Harlem streets that is eternal. And it goes on. This was the British edition, but the US edition just called it a child story for adults. And what was so interesting about the book, and why I think it was misunderstood at that time, was the way that it was bending genre. And this was something that he was also doing in If Beale Street Could Talk, not bending genre, but bending gender. He wrote, If Beale Street Could Talk was his only novel, narrated from the first person perspective of a Black woman, which is sort of unheard of. So he was really experimenting and pushing himself as an artist in the 70s in ways that were just coming to appreciate. But what's remarkable about this book also is that it's written entirely in Black English, okay? He has that remarkable essay he wrote a few years later, "If Black English isn't a language, then tell me what is." He was really committed here to celebrating the language of his childhood and also the language of the childhood of his nieces and nephews. So when you read this book, you are carried along with this sort of poetic language, but it doesn't have much of a plot. And it's very hard to tell who the audience is supposed to be. But as I read it more and more, I just became so curious about it. So I wrote to David Leeming, Baldwin's wonderful biographer, to see if he could put me in touch with Joran Kazak, this French artist. There was one paragraph about him in the biography, and he wrote me back. This was in like 1996, and he said, "I never met him. I don't know anybody who is." A few years later, I was in grad school right here at Columbia, and I sent out a bunch of emails to art historians in Paris, saying, leaving my phone number. "Do you know anything about this person, Joran Kazak? He may be dead, but I'd like to get more information about him." 3 weeks later, I'm sitting in my studio apartment in Brooklyn. The phone rings. It's this raspy French-accented man calling from Paris, telling me he's alive and heard I'm looking for him. Would I like to come over there to see an exhibition? I was getting my PhD. I had no money. I signed up for my third credit card, booked a plane ticket, and really from there is where the republication effort came. As the book itself was a collaboration between two very close friends, Baldwin and Joran. But the republication was a collaboration between the Kazak family and the Baldwin family. It was a collaboration across generations, across transatlantically, across race. And it was a really meaningful, we had the launch event at the Schomburg, and we just had another one at the African American History and Culture Museum in DC. So it's been a long road, but it's been beautiful to bring it back into print. And I think it's very appropriate that If Beale Street Could Talk is sort of getting renewed attention now, because they are part of this shift towards sort of interracial dynamics, but also, I think, fairly radical experimentation with literary form that Baldwin hasn't been fully credited with before.
Yeah, and I think an important book to read to children, because it really covers what it's like. I mean, the poverty, the racial injustice, everything, the policemen, the police brutality.
Police brutality,
all of it is there. So, and in Black English. And so you are really, for a child who isn't growing up in Harlem or in these circumstances, it serves as a way to help that child or that adult really understand. And the illustrations, Joran Kazak had never been to Harlem, and he never came to Harlem. So, I mean, that's a wonderful story about Buford Delaney telling when he suggested to James Baldwin that he look in a puddle, and perhaps you can tell that story.
Sure. I mean, and Gabby and I can talk about it. Baldwin told the story many times in many essays, but when Buford Delaney was his mentor when he was like 16 or 17 in the Village, they were walking down Broadway, and he pointed at a puddle of water and said, "Look, what do you see?" And Baldwin looked at it and he said, "I don't see anything. I see a puddle of water." And then Delaney said, "Look again." And he looked more closely, and he saw, sort of floating in the water, the reflection of the buildings around into something sort of strangely, unexpectedly beautiful. And so that's an example of how Delaney taught him to see. And this book is all about sight and seeing. This is Blinky, who is actually based on Aisha Karefa Smart, one of Baldwin's nieces. And she wears these eyeglasses that who were given her by white teachers at school. And there's some wonderful moments where TJ says, he doesn't understand. He can't see out of those glasses, but she can. So why, what's wrong with her? But in fact, as the book progresses, the kids start to recognize variations in color. So Baldwin was always sort of, deconstructing these binaries of black and white. But in fact, sometimes the kid's skin color is described as like honey. Other times it's like coffee early in the morning. So that's what I mean by this turn to the interracial dynamics and really looking at Black life and Blackness as multiple, right? It's not, couldn't be reduced to what, the racism that he was fighting against was trying to reduce it to.
I think, there's an exhibit up now at the David Zerner Gallery in Chelsea on 19th Street and 10th Avenue, curated by Hilton Isles, and the title is God Made My Face, a collective portrait of James Baldwin. It's wonderful. I recommend. It's open, I think, till the middle of February. And when you go to the exhibit, you realize how much the visual arts and theater and all of this meant in Baldwin's life. He actually went to school with Richard Avedon. And even in Beale Street, when you read it carefully and you look at the musical references, I made some notes, and there's all the gospel hymns and Aretha Franklin's Respect, Spanish Harlem, protest songs, Marvin Gaye.
The title itself is W.C. Handy.
Billie Holiday. Yeah. So maybe you can talk, and of course, Fonnie is an artist. I mean, I think maybe both of you can speak a little bit to this theater and art and everything the rhythm that is what makes his language so rich in his writing.
Well, I do think it's important, when we note that Little Man is composed in, so-called Black English. I mean, there is no one version of Black English. There are many Englishes. I myself am from a part of the Caribbean. There's another kind of quote-unquote Black English there. And the version that we see in Little Man is very interesting because it's very simple, but also very complex. And it's very easy when you're young to sort of have this impression that the way that I might speak to my friends is not correct, or it makes me somehow lesser to speak like this. And when you read a book that's actually composed like this, it's kind of very affirming. I remember growing up thinking that nobody would want to read a book that was written the way that I spoke to my friends. I thought nobody would ever publish this. I hadn't discovered other Caribbean writers at that time or other writers who were using vernacular, but that's kind of the point. There is not as much of this as we might think. There's much more today, of course, but it's still a radical move to use the rhythms of that kind of language. And in the same decade that this book was published, Ralph Ellison, who had composed Invisible Man, wrote this remarkable essay in Time magazine based on a viewer's question of what America would be like if Black people had never come to this country. So somebody actually asked him this extraordinary question, and he responded in a very interesting way. He said that America was inconceivable without Black people for many reasons, but one of them was language. The language that we speak, regardless of who we are or where we come from, is not even imaginable without the contributions from how Black people have spoken for centuries. And a lot of this language was language that came out of necessity, language that people had to learn to communicate with people who had been forcibly brought across an ocean and who did not speak the same languages. The rhythms that form jazz, that form so many other things, would they form the DNA of the language and the music that we enjoy today, that we use today, whether or not we know it. And so Little Man is a very simple book on the surface, but it's an utterly radical book philosophically, because it's making this argument without explicitly saying it, that the way this kid speaks is the way that everybody in some way speaks, even if they don't know it. And so there's something musical about this language, but also essential in this very interesting way. So there's so many layers to this book, and also, of course, to If Beale Street Could Talk. But this book that seems so normal as a children's book on the surface becomes almost this modernist kind of masterpiece when you delve in a little bit deeper. And of course, the essay that you alluded to by Baldwin, what is Black English? If Black English isn't a language, what is it? Baldwin makes the same argument that Ellison did, that our language would be inconceivable without African Americans, without people who have been brought from across the world forcibly. And there's something very dark and very intriguing about realizing we're a seemingly simple book for children that is also for adults is kind of making that argument as well. So there are many layers to this book.
Nick, you.
Yeah, I mean, music is essential to this book. The opening line is music is all up and down the street. TJ runs it every day, and there are images of music notes sort of floating above, but you can't see it, but come see it after. So music runs throughout the book. Mr. Mann, the janitor, is playing Night Train on his record player in the basement. There's a scene where the children are dancing to the record player, and they're doing their African strut, they call it, and a wilderness scene is bursting out of the side of the building in their imagination, and they reference they're dancing like they're in a jungle where they can't get any satisfaction, sort of riffing on the Rolling Stones, and I think sort of commenting on the history of white appropriation of black musical forms. I mean, the book it just has all kinds of references like that. Midway through it, there's a graffiti image in the back that you really wouldn't notice, but who's read Another Country and knows the character Rufus Scott? Well, there's a peace sign in graffiti above the name Rufus, and of course Rufus committed suicide, so there's a kind of rest in peace sign for him. But music also ends the book. What basically happens is one of the kids cuts his foot, and they think it's this big horrible thing, and they go underground, which of course is a popular trope in African American literature, to heal. And Mr. Mann and his wife, Miss Lee, heal the foot, and the kids start dancing together at the end to their African strut. And it's this joyful, and you wrote about it beautifully in your New York Review of Books piece, but it's this sort of joyful communal celebration, not even of the black family, but of black community, because these are friends and the janitor. So it's I think, another place where love is the unifying. And Baldwin loved music. Baldwin listened to music all the time while he was writing. Baldwin shared music with Joran Kazak so he could understand. He shared photographs of Harlem as well, and pictures of his nieces and nephews as models for the book. But so music was extremely important to him. And if Beale Street Could Talk, I don't know, Gabby, how do you think music? I mean, obviously the title of the novel is If Beale Street Could Talk. What do you make of I've always wondered about the title. What do you make of the title?
Do you mean in general or in terms of music?
Well, either, yeah, in general or in terms of, yeah.
In general.
I mean, if you approach the title just as it is, you get a very interesting sort of image. A street speaking, a street sharing its secrets. It would be very dangerous for many people if streets and buildings could talk, because then they would reveal the secrets that we might not want them to. Some of these secrets would be funny, some of them might end up on TMZ, and some of them might end up in much darker places. And it's those latter secrets that I think Baldwin is referencing in the title. I mean, Beale Street was important to Baldwin for many reasons. I think if you just approach this title as a layperson, though, you get something very rich out of it, which is, this is the oft unspoken truth of these streets. This is what it's like to be somebody like me. And of course, there's the fact that, as you alluded to, Baldwin is speaking through a woman, Tish, which is remarkable. Baldwin does not often do this. And her depiction has divided critics, but in many ways, I think she speaks as somebody who we would like to listen to, somebody who has things to say that are important to listen to. There are a few points where I think Baldwin might be guilty of what Audre Lorde famously said he was guilty of, which was being a man and not always understanding what it's like to not be this. There's a scene in the book where Tish is very uncomfortably pressed up close to a man in the subway, as those of us who take the subway will undoubtedly know the experience of. And I think that if you're accustomed to being perceived as a woman, it often comes across in a very specific way when a man is very close to you and you do not know who this person is or what his intentions might be. And Baldwin sort of brushes this off, or rather Tish sort of brushes this off as, the man doesn't want to do anything to me, he's just innocent. And perhaps he is, but perhaps he isn't. And it's little moments like this where I think that, if Beale Street could talk, it would tell Baldwin something a little bit more about what it's like not just to be a black man on the streets, but also what it's like to be a black woman. Something that Audre Lorde talked about at length, the difference in struggles between these groups. That black men suffer at tremendous depths and in tremendous ways, but there is still a difference in how black women are treated and what black women are expected to do and to hold up and to suffer through. And these little things come through in If Beale Street Could Talk, and in some ways they also don't. It's not a perfect book for those reasons, but no book really is. And I think it comes as close to that as you can get. Yeah, but I think the title is just endlessly resonant. And I think you should keep that image in your mind as well. What would these streets tell you if you listened to them? And would you be prepared to hear what they would tell you?
So now we'd like to open this to your questions, and there's a microphone here. Yes.
Thank you all very much. To answer that question briefly from my own perspective, having just seen the movie, if Beale Street could talk, he never would have been convicted because they would have seen that scene where he pushes the policeman. Anyway, I just wrote a few words about this. For those of you who have read any of James Baldwin's books, you know how profound he is. Although his writing skills and emotions portrayed could not be translated to the silver screen, having been given a well-adapted script, the actors come very close with outstanding performances. The story comes through loud and clear, one we especially need to hear today. The ultimate deep sadness we're left with is its own message.
Thank you all for your thoughts. It was really enlightening to hear both of you, all three of you. I haven't heard anybody talk about the parents. The tenderness came through the parents. That's what I related to in the book. I wonder if you had any thoughts on that. The parents of
Talking
Tish.
about the parents in If Beale Street.
Yeah, in the book. I haven't seen the movie.
About Tish's parents, too.
Yeah.
Tish, yeah, Tish's parents and also Bonnie's. Yeah.
And we're talking about the movie.
Talking about the movie or the book? You're talking about the book.
Oh, good, good, okay. the book.
Okay.
I mean, Tish's mother is an extraordinary representation of what I was just talking about. The black woman who must go to unimaginable lengths to try to keep something together. In this case, her family, because the woman who is accused Fani of rape flees to Puerto Rico, and she must track him down. Tish's mother must track her down to try to extract some sort of confession or perhaps some sort of additional nuance from her about what happened. So she actually goes to Puerto Rico. And this is much more detailed in the book than in the movie. She, has to talk to all kinds of people in a place she's never been. She has to almost go undercover, kind of, and she has no training for this sort of mild espionage, in a sense. And she fails, ultimately. She doesn't actually get the woman to admit, assuming that she's wrong, that Fani was probably not the person who did this. So in some ways, she goes there for nothing, but in many ways, she goes there for everything because it's her mother's love that compels her to do this. And imagine what it's like to go to a place you've never been to, looking for a person you scarcely know, to get a confession out of them. That's pretty hardcore, and not everybody would do this. Tish's father is also very understanding. And there's a good contrast, I think, also not as much in the movie, between Tish's father and Fawny's father. Fawny's father is easily prone to violence. Fawny's mother is extremely rigidly religious. She actually accuses Tish of essentially blasphemy by having a child out of wedlock and having a child that is, in her mind, not going to be something that Tish can raise because she doesn't appreciate the family that Fawny chose to, marry into eventually. And Fawny's father actually hits her very early on in the book. And in the movie, it's very visceral, the way that he hits her. You feel her slapping the floor, and you can feel her pain. She is not a person you're meant to connect with, but Baldwin makes you empathize with everybody, even the people who aren't the best. So yeah, the parents are very, very moving characters as well. Do you have any other thoughts on?
No, I would say I think that again, this is part of this period in his career. I mean, one of my favorite photos. I mean, it's not a photo. Images is the family at breakfast in the book, and so Little Man explores, like at Beale Street, some of the darker things: police brutality, drug addiction, alcoholism. It's not shying away from any of this, but it's not a one note. It's also representing like love in family, super nurturing. But the kid is also afraid because he knows that some of his friends' fathers disappeared. So he has nightmares, right, about where he knows my father going to disappear. And so the book is just extraordinary in that way, that it sort of delves into the psychic life of children in a way that we're starting to see that more in children's literature and YA literature today. But in 1976, I mean, that wasn't really happening. Yeah.
I might say I called Book Culture, which is on 112th Street, one of my favorite independent bookstores, and they do have copies of the book. So, and I really do highly recommend it. So as you're leaving the cathedral, if you want to walk down 112th Street, you can actually stop and buy a copy. Do we have another question?
Thank you. Thanks a lot for the conversation. I'm wondering what it means for Fawny, who's an artist, and so two people are denied voice in the book, right? There's Fawny, who's an artist who's jailed, and there's a woman who's been raped, right? So I wonder what it means for these two characters to be, essentially jailed throughout the novel.
Well, it goes back to the title, right? If Beale Street, if Beale Street could talk, there are two of those voices, those walls. But I mean, there's that amazing line that Tish shows where she says it's something about it's a terrible thing when you try to love someone through glass. And so I think that relates to your question and the silencing. I don't know. I hadn't thought about Fawny. Is Fawny silenced?
I wouldn't characterize him as being entirely silenced. I mean, I do think metaphorically, of course, he is silenced in the sense that he is behind bars, in the present time of this narrative. And there is something broader to this, the idea of so many Black people being falsely imprisoned or falsely accused and then imprisoned, either for trivial offenses or something that never even happened, and thus being denied a voice. it is important to note, too, that the woman that you mentioned, she's also a person of color. She's from a place that really gets no attention unless a hurricane hits it, which is Puerto Rico. And as a person from another country that a hurricane hit, who even fewer people know about, I kind of understand the feeling. And there's something that Baldwin might be trying to tell us in the fact that we don't hear that much from her. We just don't listen to people from colonized countries enough. So often the Caribbean, I'm using Puerto Rico as a stand-in for this, so often we are forgotten. People don't know we exist. When I went to college in Florida, my mail went to the wrong country because people didn't know that I lived in the country that I did. They thought I lived in the Dominican Republic, which is not where I live. And so it's not entirely surprising that her voice is not as prominent as it could be, because people like her, including women who make accusations, are often silenced. It's very hard for people to take accusations seriously, even today. That's why the Me Too movement had to blossom into being. And that's why we're still fighting for it to be taken seriously. There are people forgetting that Me Too is a thing, and that's pretty frightening. So I do think you're correct. I mean, I wouldn't agree that Fani is silenced, but I do think metaphorically he kind of is. Does that make any sense? I might be rambling, but okay.
Why do we have one more question? Yes.
Hi, thanks again for having us. I wanted to build on the last question in regard to Daniel specifically, because while Fani is in jail, his family does come from I wouldn't say necessarily a higher class than Tish's family, but they are much more well off, and they are a complete family, while Daniel was alone with his mother in a much different situation, even though they all lived near each other at a certain point in childhood. And Daniel specifically also goes back to jail and has been in jail in the past. And the one time in the novel that he seems to have a voice was with his friends between Fani and Tish. And that was very difficult for him to talk about his experiences because, one, they were horrible experiences, but two, I don't think he really ever had people he could talk to besides his own mother. So on that question of silencing and maybe bringing in class, how would you say, what is the role of Daniel in If Beale Street Could Talk? Thank you.
Well, I do just want to start for those of you, who have only seen the movie, what Daniel reveals in the book is very different, or at least is a lot clearer in the book than what he reveals in the movie. Those of you who have seen the film, you might remember a very dark, very sort of moving scene where Daniel begins to tell Fani that something happened to him in jail. Now, he can't actually articulate what this is, or at least he won't. And there is something very real in this, the idea that it's hard to talk about abuse. However, in the book, he does articulate that he was in fact abused in prison. And again, this is not something that we talk about enough. And so Daniel comes out as a person carrying the weight of shame. And he doesn't have a very prominent voice in the book, partly because he's taken away again for something trivial, and he's a key witness, but the lawyer for the family of Tish cannot really get a hold of Daniel because they won't let the lawyer talk to him, or at very least he has to jump through many flaming hoops to try to get to Daniel. And I think that's pretty telling in of itself. But you do make an excellent point that class is also not something we talk about enough. And you see this in the movie, I think even more clearly then in the book, when Fonny's mother comes in, dressed to the nine. She's in her designer clothes, and her daughters are also dressed, in this very sort of notable fashion. Like, look at me, I'm wealthy. And it's not that there's anything wrong with this so much as that it is an immediate contrast to Tish's family. And perhaps you could say a few words about this as well, but I think this is Baldwin sort of trying to show that there's a big tendency when white critics talk about what it is to be black in America to sort of assume that everybody is the same. But there's so many intersections of experience, gender, and also class. And to be wealthy and black in America is, still to be black in America, but it is also slightly different. And perhaps you could sort of continue off those.
Sure, we all know Baldwin was writing about all these intersections of identity, class, race, gender, sexuality, nation. And I think, with respect to the film versus the novel, I think it's almost never fair to kind of place them in competition because they're different art forms, right? And they're accomplishing different things. But I will, there are other, the beautiful thing about seeing on screen was how much Baldwin always wanted films made out of his books. And with my students, we were at the Schomburg Archive and we went into the Beale Street box and they found the first draft that he wrote of If Beale Street Could Talk on a notepad, handwritten. So he would handwrite first and then later he would type it up. But I think my hope from that film is exactly that it will continue to open the floodgates for more black directors, more directors in Hollywood, but in particular, more of Baldwin's novels being made into films. He was dying to have Giovanni's Room made into a film. He was dying to he did write the screenplay of Malcolm X. So my hope is that this is, hopefully like a dramatic shift and that these more complex representations that include all these kinds of intersections will be in the big screen, will be in our schools. And I think that's part of what's really exciting about this resurgence around Baldwin today. He's always been a huge icon, of course, but we're finally allowing him to speak in all of his complex pluralities. Yeah.
I do just want to add really quickly too, thought of this after I pass it on. I think a good representation of that intersection is actually a movie I saw very recently, The Green Book, which is about the famous pianist, Don Shirley, who is a black man who initially is portrayed as being sort of almost stuck up. He's very wealthy. In some ways, he's insulated from, at least you might think he is, from what poor black people might struggle through. But then he decides to take a tour of the South. And he needs to take the so-called Green Book, which showed places where it was safe to be black, places like hotels, restaurants, etc., that you would be allowed to eat in or sleep in. And he takes that book, he goes with a very, an Italian-American driver who has a lot to learn about race. He goes on this journey, and his privilege vanishes, a privilege in terms of wealth, that is, because he's immediately seen as nothing more than a black man. It doesn't matter how much money he's made. When he passes through a certain part of, I think, Alabama, the police pull him over because it's too late at night, and it's a sundown town, meaning that you're not allowed to be there if you're black when the sun sets. They arrest him just because he's black, and it's dark, and he's dark, and those two intersect. And in that darkness, his privilege also vanishes. So there are many intersections, but there is a point at which those two vanish. And it's also important to remember that as well.
If we've encouraged more interest in James Baldwin. I want to say that Rich Blent, who's another Baldwin scholar, is doing a reading group at the 92nd Street Y beginning in February. And there's recently, it's been released on YouTube, a 2-hour interview of Nikki Giovanni when she was 24 years old with James Baldwin in conversation. He was 47. It was in 1971 in London. It's just a fascinating interview. And if you watch it and then think about our conversation, some of it will kind of make sense. And I sort of walk around with my Library of America Baldwin essays in my bag. It's always, they have the 3 volumes with the short novels, the longer novels, and the essays. So anyway, I thank you all for coming, and we hope to have another conversation in March. We don't have the date yet, but it will be on the Cathedral of St. John website. So thank you. Thank you, Gabby and